Today's April 11, 2021. We're in Tucson.
And I am not about to sit down and play the piano.
Jeff and I have been working on a game.
And the idea came from listening to the radio a couple of weeks back when we were just about to return to Tucson. And we heard about a game on Sirius XM radio, I think it was on BBC, a fellow who created a game based on capitalism. And basically that game was set up so they could show the results of the race to the bottom that occurs when all kinds of corporations are looking for the almighty buck. And they want to establish their dominance in whatever industry they're involved with. But this game is not about that. This is a game that's more about...
And our new game is called ACES to ACES.
So it's more about life in general. But since the game of life already exists, we couldn't call it that. But there's a reason for calling it ACES to ACES, because it is a card game.
Here's our homemade board.
Yeah, it's kind of a prototype. And it comes out of the fact that, cards are actually deeply symbolic. They, as you well know, they consist of 4 suits. And each of the suits has 13 cards, beginning with an ace and ending with a king. But what you may not know is that there's a system of hierarchy or structure to the cards that has to do with less with the numbers, but more with the suits. For instance, take a look at this, Vanessa. This is the symbol right here for spades, which you'd have to turn apart a little bit. Spades. Now, who knows what that really represents? You could make some conjecture. But basically, spades is practical stuff. It's living in the world, having to do things, typically with your body or whatever, but it could be extended to things like career and everything else.
Right, as representative of a shovel.
Yeah, shovel. The material world where you have to do stuff. And so anything that has to do with spades has to do with a long process of starting at the ace and then going through cycles that represent 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, jack, queen, king, and returning to ace. This is the part most people don't like about life. They don't mind so much being born, but they don't like returning to the ace because that represents death. So in this game, the goal of whoever is playing this suit is to get to be the king. And I'll explain more later. Meanwhile, the next step up is what we call the spade series was practical. This series is psychological. So this is a series of evolution of the psyche, how you mature. You mature from hope when you're first born, which is the first step of Erickson's synthesis of trust versus mistrust.
Right, Erik Erikson.
Erik Erikson. Hope through faith, faith to knowledge, verifying faith, and ultimately truth, which verifies knowledge. And so that's a process you might go through psychologically, arriving at the fundamental truth of all things, which borders on the philosophical, but basically is a psychological process, knowing what truth is. Beyond the practical and the psychological, there's the creative aspect of life. And it's represented by the hearts. It's what you love to do. It's the thing that inspires your life. Now, if you might have noticed that I mentioned that hope, faith, knowledge, and truth were the psychological loop, and that surviving, I didn't mention, thriving, emerging, and control is the whole idea of practical reality. But in terms of the creative life, the first thing you do is you aspire, then you try something, and if you stick with it, persevere, you may ultimately succeed to one degree or another, or whatever your art is. It could be anything. It could be the art of life, never mind being a musician or a painter, sculptor, photographer. It could even be being a great martial artist, anything that really motivates you through your heart that you really want to do. Of course, that's psychological, but we broke it out here because of the suits of the cards, hearts. There is one final stage, and this is the overarching, basic, fundamental issue. It's called the archetypal level. Now, on the archetypal level, the interesting thing is that it's all about stress. It's about the fact that in life, what you experience is tension. And when that tension gets to a certain point, you experience a crisis. And when you get to a crisis, ideally, you come up with some kind of solution. And ultimately, some kind of solution leads to a resolution of whatever that tension was that initially was there. Well, on a practical level, all that tension, crisis, solution, and resolution has to do with surviving, thriving, emerging, and controlling stuff. All on a high psychological level, it all has to do with hope and faith and knowledge and truth. On a creative level, it has to do with your aspirations, your attempting to do something, your perseverance with it, and your success. So we call this the archetypal level because it informs all the other levels. So now you get a sense that there's like degrees of abstraction occurring here, from life in the practical world all the way up to what you might call Plato's archetypes and the dynamics that are existing on a deeply spiritual or creative level, spiritual level. So those are all embodied in the cards based on their suits. For instance, I have a 5 of diamonds. Now the diamonds, of course, would fit in with the psychologic because that's the diamonds there, and the 5 would be associated with the beginnings of faith. All right, all this is very important. As I read the rules, you're going to understand basically how to play the game. The game of aces to aces is incredibly complicated, and you have to be familiar with the rules, but that's just pretty much like life. Life is tremendously complicated. Life, practical life, psychological life, creative life, archetypal, it's all very, very complicated, interactive, and dynamic. Everything connects to everything else. So the challenge of this game was first to figure out how we were going to take the cards and use them as keys in the playing of the game, and also what they may hint at so that you could play the game well. So right now the game is so complicated, the best thing I can do is simply read the rules, and when we get to certain points, Vanessa may ask me some questions. Sorry if you can't. But before I read the rules of the game, I have this one thing to say. Nobody gets to copyright this game. Nobody owns this game. The game was created by Vanessa and I, and you can make your own board, you can buy your own deck of cards, and like we've done here, we use coins as our tokens, and you can make a board for yourself any way you want. Anybody who wants to manufacture a board, I don't care, Milton Bradley or anybody else, they just can't own the game. They have no rights to it. We're not claiming any right except this: we originated the game. So, let's proceed with the rules. The rules are so complicated, I have to read them. And if you just get a vague idea of how to play the game, that's fine. We will follow up with some actual playing of the game, which will illustrate it better. Frankly, most complicated games you're initiated into by somebody who plays it. For instance, cribbage. You can sit down and read how to play cribbage, and you might be able to figure it out, you might not. But when you play cribbage with somebody, which is also a card game, it becomes natural. You may not be good at it at first, but eventually you learn how to do all the things that a good cribbage player does. If you, try and persevere, you might actually succeed at getting to the point where you win a cribbage game now and again. It's true of any card game, any kind of game, anything in life. The rules. The game is called Aces to Aces. It originates with Vanessa and I. We have developed it over the last couple of weeks. It was not easy. The problem was making it fun and challenging, and that it was like shifting sand, so every game is different. The goal of Aces to Aces depends on which suit you enter the game as, and I'll explain how you enter a game later. Each suit depends on the ace or aces you may have during the opening rounds of the game. To play Aces to Aces, there must be at least one other player. You could probably try playing it solitaire. I haven't tried it. You could do it to learn the game, but it's not going to be as much fun because you'll have too many competing interests when you play the game. Each player may hold and play up to as many as 3 aces. So if there's only 2 players, one of you could end up with 3 and the other could end up with 1. Doesn't matter. There's so many competing interests in the game, only one real player will emerge as having won the game. But I have to qualify what it means to win the game. Each player must play at least 1 ace in the game. All right, which means there has to be some way for a person who doesn't get an ace on an initial deal or any other card that they need to be able to get that card, and I'll explain that later. The goal of the ace of spades, this is the practical dude down here, and he's interested in surviving, thriving, and then emerging from the crowd and then eventually controlling, if not only his own life, other people's lives. And we've covered this before in a video called The Ladder of Success. We just don't bring it to the same level of resolution as Ladder of Success. But you may want to familiarize with yourself, because this practical game is the game most people play when they ignore the other factors like their psyches, their creativity, and the archetypes that are governing the game of life. All right. The goal of the ace of spades player is to get to be a king of spades before any other player gets to their suit's king. So as long as spades gets to be king, before anybody else done, spades wins the game and the game's over. That doesn't mean they have to get to ace, and I'll tell you why they don't want to get to ace. Because ace is death, and most people who are in life don't want to die. So you win as spades if you get to ace, whereas the other players, king, whereas the other players have to get to ace to win. Okay, so we just discussed the goal of the ace of spades, which is get to be king before anybody else. Now let's go on to the ace of diamonds. That's the psychological level, right? Their goal is to out-psych other people, which means practically outthink them, to get to ace before any other player gets one other player. All they have to do is get to ace before one of the other three players gets to jack, because they want to basically dominate the game. And so they win if the diamonds player gets to ace, even if two other players have gotten to court cards like queens or kings, as long as a third player does not get to jack, they win when they get to ace. And the reason for this is the diamonds is really a representation of the idea of swords and conflict. And you want to be the winner. And also, you want to be the real winner, you want other people to have to lose. And the jack gets to win the whole game if it gets to ace before one of the other players gets to jack. That's their whole goal. So obviously they're going to make choices and decisions during the course of the game to block at least one other player from getting from 10 on the board to jack on the board. To reiterate, whoever's playing spades, which is the practical, wants to get to be king before anybody else, and they win. The player who is playing diamonds wants to get to be an ace before at least one of the other players fails to make court card, which means before they get to jack. Just one. Doesn't mean the other three, they just have to block one player from getting to be a jack. Now the hearts player is like it says. The hearts player would like to see everyone succeed. So the goal of the ace of hearts player is to get all players to at least a jack before any other player gets to ace. So basically the hearts player wants to defeat the jacks player, because the hearts player wins if everybody gets to at least be a jack. Isn't that cool? Because they have an open, empathic, compassionate heart. They want everybody to feel empowered to at least get to the point of jack, because a jack always represents a position of accomplishment. It's part of the court. To reiterate, for spades to win, they just want to get to king first. For diamonds to win, they want to get to ace before at least one person doesn't get to jack. For the hearts person to win, they want to get to ace before, but only after, be the first one to get to ace after everyone else has gotten to at least jack. But here's the most interesting one. The clubs person has their goal too, and it's the most exalted and difficult goal of all. The goal of the ace of clubs player is to get all players to king before any player aces. In other words, the ace of clubs on an archetypal level is managing the whole process in such a way that everybody wins without what? Really winning. In other words, without getting to ace. So they don't want the spades person to get to king first. But they do want the other ones to get to be kings, and then they want the last player who's behind them all to get to king 2. And they can do this because they manage the flow of the game. They know when to speed. They can speed someone up, and they can slow them down based on the rules. So far I said if there's less than 4 players, you can draw a card from the card pile, leftover cards. You can trade a card to another player for a useful card. And then the next step, once you get that card, is you got to describe that received card to establish a token position on the game board. But you know what? If you just got the card and I'm trying to slow you down and I'm the clubster guy, I'm going to say, no, you're going to have to wait till your next turn to do that. Or if you're dragging behind everybody else, I'm going to say, go right ahead, describe it, because I want you to catch up. All right. Then another thing that has to happen is others get to weigh in. So if I say something like the 2 of spades is like a 15-year-old kid and he's aspiring, and then everybody looks down the board and says, you know, a two of spades, 15-year-old kid, and it has something to do with aspiring? That's completely false, dude. I ain't accepting that. So you'd have to say something about the 2 of spades that makes sense from the point of view of survival. That's all. And if the other players will have a chance to comment on what you said, and if they don't like it, they're going to go thumbs down, but ultimately it's up to the clubs player to decide whether you actually describe that position on the board well, based on the keywords that are on the board. All right, so after allowing others to weigh in, and that could be done the very first time you get the card, or it can all be slowed down because you're racing ahead. Then the clubs player decides how legitimate your description is of the card and position, and finally allows the other players, that player's token, to advance. Now he can say, I agree with your description, but you have to wait for another turn. Or she can say, you're going to have to wait for another turn before you can advance, because he's trying to slow you down. You're running too soon. You're getting ahead of everybody, so that wants to put the brakes on things. Or potentially, the clubs player could have you do every one of these things in a single step, because he's trying to catch up. And that's how you manage the game flow, because as the clubs player, what do you want? Everybody to be a king before someone becomes an ace. To ace out, a player must progress their token from acing in, which means they have to understand what their goal is, to acing out. That means they must have an ace of some suit by initial deal, draw, trade, or gift, and then when they progress all the way through the intervening numbers and court cards, they get to king. They have to basically say something intelligible about the entire process. And it has to be accepted by the guy who's managing clubs. Now the clubs person can say, oh my God, I'm only going to win if this guy goes out right now. And then you could say the most perfect thing in the world, and then the clubs player could say, no, I'm not accepting it. Well, they haven't been honorable. They have to go ahead and say, no, you did a good job of describing all that. You are able to ace out, and if you ace out under the conditions as described by your suit, you will win the game. Since clubs is managing flow, they may hold on to a strategic card to slow a player's progress. They may also gift a card to speed them up. They themselves may lag behind, so trading or being gifted may be desirable for them themselves. They may have to advance their own position because they're behind. Drawing cards is, if there happens to be only 3 or 2 players, drawing cards is often too random, so it might be better to go and trade or be gifted a card that you need in order to move forward. Remember, clubs player wants everybody to move together forward together. Since hearts wants everyone to get to be empowered, that means become court cards before they go out, but they may choose to give away or retain cards freely. They just may not even mention they have this card, since they're trying to slow somebody down, especially the diamonds, who's trying to race out before so everybody else loses and they win. Since spades wants to be king first, not ace out, they will do what they can to make this possible. All right. Finally, towards the end of the game, somebody may be holding out on a card. It's very important. The player who's got the management function, the clubs, can call them out and say, you've got a card this person needs, you must trade or gift it to them. But if they don't have the card, the clubs player's made a mistake, and that sets things back a little bit. All right. We're about to discuss actually how to play the game in real time.